Good morning, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Florian Martin-Bariteau. I'm a professor in the law school and the director of the Center for Law, Technology and Society. And I'm delighted to welcome you today for this new event. And so today our event is titled, Whose Security Are We Talking About Anyway? The case of Amazon Ring. And I'm delighted to be joined by two friends and colleagues. Dr. Kristen Thomasen, who is an associate professor and the senior chair of Law, Robotics and Society at the University of Windsor Faculty of Law, and an associate member of CLTS. And Professor Jane Baily, who is a full professor within the Faculty of Law Common Law section at the University of Ottawa, and a faculty member of CLTS. And today they will be presenting some of their research and be then in conversation with you about a chapter they co-wrote with Dr. Jacquelyn Burkell from University of Western Ontario for a book I had the delight to co-edit with my friend and colleague, Dr. Emily Laidlaw, titled The Security of Self, in which we try to reframe cybersecurity discourses and even the concept of cybersecurity. And so without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Kristen and Jane. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks, Florian. Yeah. It's a total thrill to be, I'm on sabbatical, but when I found out Kristen was coming, I'm like, yeah, I'm coming to co-present a paper with Kristen. So it's great to have you here, have you back at the faculty. So Florian gave you the context of the work that we're talking about as a chapter in his forthcoming book. And our chapter looks at the issue from the perspective of oppression-based tech-facilitated violence. So it's sort of trying to think about what the relationship of that is with cybersecurity, including, as you'll see, becomes particularly relevant for our case study, gender-based tech-facilitated violence, including intimate partner violence and domestic violence, as well as a systemic racist violence. And the key argument that we make in the chapter is that digital security technologies, like other technologies, that are presented as offering protection, can actually cause harm, particularly to members of groups who are most at risk of social and political marginalization. And to bring the issues into clearer focus, we use Amazon Ring as a case study. So the approach today, I'm going to talk for a few minutes, just doing some stage setting, and then Kristen is going to dive into the analysis of our analysis of Amazon Ring. And then we're hoping to save lots of time for conversation with you. In fact, we have some questions for you. So two kind of concepts that I want to sort of put on the table and let you know how we're working with them. First, obviously, is cybersecurity, and the other is tech-facilitated violence. So cybersecurity first. So the amazing thing about Florian and Emily's forthcoming collection is that it's inviting authors to reimagine cybersecurity in ways that really center the human in the conversation, which by definition suggests that cybersecurity doesn't currently center the human. So let me say a bit about that. So what we see sort of historic traditional approaches to cybersecurity have tended to focus on it as being about protecting digital systems like databases and computers from digitally mediated threats. So, for example, hacking. And the primary concern in the sort of mainstream traditional dialogue is around national and corporate interests, right? So in this conception, people are primarily threats to the system, and this. When you do your risk assessment, you define your threat as people, then that invites certain kinds of solutions. So amping up digital security solutions and security training for the humans who tend to be treated as the weak links in the loop. But tech solutions, as we all know, are not necessarily apt responses for resolving complex human problems. And worse yet, they can actually create new problems for people. And marginalized communities, for example, may be particularly at risk of new negative consequences when the problems are defined from and fixed from the perspective of the understanding of members of dominant communities. The way that they see the problem and the way that they see the solution might not only not protect marginalized community members, it actually may put them in further jeopardy. And there are, of course, this is like not a monolithic field, obviously. There are human-centric cybersecurity approaches, obviously. Debord and Dupont are two people that are centering the protection of human rights and civil society as the ultimate goal of protecting digital assets. So in some respects, the dialogue is changing, and there is a renewed focus on putting the human back into the equation. In our analysis, we're suggesting that we probably need to go further, and in particular think not just about humans, but centering the human rights of humans from marginalized communities. That this is a next step. And feminist scholars in the area, Strohmeyer, other anti-oppression and ethical approaches, for example, by Nissenbaum, are adding to this discussion and making the point, reiterating the point that technology isn't simply and only vulnerable to attacks, but it actually creates and facilitates individual and systemic violence, which are obviously undermine human rights. So in other words, when it comes to human security, technology is as much to be protected against as it is to be protected. And so these authors are centering the human in the discussion of cybersecurity. They want to make it clear that protection of the system and assets cannot come at the expense of human safety and security. And within this critical group, there's a group of feminist tech scholars who have focused on technology-facilitated violence in particular. So that brings me to the second concept that I wanted to talk about. So in the feminist literature on cybersecurity, the work of Strohmeyer is very prominent in our research. It's a recognition of the fact that digital technologies themselves enable and perpetrate individual and systemic forms of violence. And when we think about it, this security this way, human security is positioned slightly differently. It's seen as something that is at risk from technology. And this literature also goes further to highlight the fact that technology-facilitated violence is not evenly borne. There's lots of research on this topic, but are instead disproportionately experienced by members of communities marginalized by sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, and other oppressions and their intersections. So if we're worried about the security of those communities, this body of literature says we have to be open to the idea that tech is not only a protector and or something to be protected from threats, but as something that poses a threat to human security. And that helps us think a little bit more clearly about how one community's technological protection might be understood and experienced as another's threat. And this invites a conversation about a risk assessment that takes into account a broader range of communities, but in particular centers those from marginalized communities. In our paper, Tech-Facilitated Violence, just to be clear, it's a focus on violence and harms caused or facilitated by digital communications tools and technology surveillance solutions. And it includes physical, sexual, emotional, and psychological harms, including harassment and coercive control. And it focuses not just on acts by individuals against other individuals, but systemic and structural outcomes that can result from, for example, algorithmic processes. So we're striving and have been in the work that we've been doing for quite a while to go well beyond individually perpetrated tech-facilitated violence, to think about how systems themselves are repeating and exacerbating exclusion and disproportionate targeting of marginalized communities, exposing them to discriminatory algorithmic sorting that negatively affects their access to resources like credit and jobs, how it can amplify social fragmentation, which we're seeing so very clearly, and especially in particular in recent years, how it amplifies harmful online content. And in the context of technologies that are used, for example, by law enforcement, it actually increases the likelihood of incarceration by members of marginalized communities. So if we bring together these sort of feminist anti-oppression approaches to cybersecurity with this broader understanding of technology-facilitated violence, we see some themes emerging. The current focus traditional focus, I'm not going to say current, the traditional focus of cybersecurity on external threats to systems means that the design of the technology itself can reflect and perpetuate the privileged perspective of those who dominate tech design, which is predominantly white male designers. And by doing so, it obfuscates seeing internally initiated threats as something that need to be taken into account when designing systems. So, for example, recognizing that intimate partners may use GPS systems in their partners' phones to monitor their movements signals a concern about an assessment of threat that isn't about the threat to the system, but it's the threat that can happen from the use of the system, so it's internal. So how do we develop and design and develop technology that doesn't just minimize external threats, but also centers threats by known others? And of course, this is particularly important in the context of intimate partner violence and domestic violence. And the context of home security system is particularly relevant in that regard. Where we see women in domestic violence situations are most at risk from people that they know and trust, that is, people internal to the system, and often people who are responsible for setting up the systems themselves and controlling access to them. So if we don't, without taking that into account, we're not going to design systems that guard against this. And so we wind up with security systems that protect some humans, but not others. And our concern is that the humans, once again, those who are left out of the protection are the same communities that tend to experience social and other forms of social and political marginalization. So what are the critical literature calls for centering the experience of those wrongly ignored previously as edge cases in cybersecurity discourse and threat assessment, centering safety and unsafety throughout the life cycle, design, development, and deployment, and a deeper engagement with the socio-technical aspects related to pervasive technologies. So that sort of sets the stage, and now I'll turn it over to Kristen to say how we sort of bring those to life in the analysis of Amazon Ring.
Thank you. And it's such an honor to be back at U Ottawa and to be co-presenting with Jane, and to have gotten to write this piece together with you and Jackie as well. So just want to say thank you for having me back. I really appreciate it. Okay, so picking up on sort of the theoretical unpacking and thinking about, what would a feminist or justice-oriented approach to cybersecurity thinking look like, we opted to use home surveillance systems and Amazon Ring in particular as a case study to unpack some of what we could learn from this. I would just say as an aside, from this collective risk assessment perspective, I think the ways in which individuals are being co-opted into a surveillance infrastructure is incredibly dangerous. And Amazon Ring is but one example. There are many systems out there on the market. I'll unpack that and talk a little bit more about it, but just, I don't know, I guess that's my political position on this situation. So we thought that home security systems were a useful case study for unpacking this, because they are pitched as a technological means of obtaining protection or security from violence. And in inspecting them more closely, especially through the lenses that Jane laid out for us, we can actually see the ways in which these types of systems can introduce or exacerbate violence into people's lives as individuals or through some of the systemic issues that they feed into or feed off of. So home surveillance systems have existed for a long time. They're not necessarily something new. What is relatively new is the way in which various home surveillance systems have become integrated and internet connected. So Amazon Ring we chose as an example because it is a very popular, like widely used surveillance system, and also it's heavily integrated. So I'll explain what that means. So you might be most familiar with the idea of that doorbell camera. Ring was a company that was acquired by Amazon in 2018, and it was developed really as sort of that camera lens looking out from your door. You can see who's at the door. It's two ways, so you can communicate with somebody. Amazon acquired it. I mean, I haven't seen this officially published, but sort of like the understanding colloquially is because it would it would be advertised to help avoid having your packages stolen off of your front porch. But it's a very integrated system. So beyond just the camera on the front door, people can purchase and associate with the Ring camera monitoring devices inside the home. So baby monitors, room monitors. People sometimes use them to assist with monitoring maybe a loved one who needs extra oversight, who might be unwell, children, of course. There's a drone that you can purchase to fly around your house. The advertising for it is like if you're away from the home and you want to see what's going on inside the house, get this drone and you can fly it around and check it out. I remember when that commercial first came out, Twitter was flooded with everyone saying, with a lot of people who I happen to follow on Twitter saying, did you talk to a single survivor of intimate partner violence before you started marketing a home drone that you could fly remotely and see what's going on inside the home? And it's integrated beyond the house as well. In ways that integrate with other homes or other neighbors who might be using Amazon systems. So there's a social media platform that you can share your videos on. And in the United States, Amazon has entered into a range of police partnerships, which are more formalized partnerships with law enforcement so that individuals using the system can fairly seamlessly send video footage to law enforcement. And law enforcement can also ping homeowners and ask more seamlessly for their video footage. A lot of these things are happening outside of just Amazon as well. Like we're seeing this developing in Canada. We haven't seen the Amazon police partnerships here, although they tried in Windsor, but it did not succeed. But we do see, different law enforcement setting up these sort of registers where you can signal that you have a home camera. Amazon basically makes the whole system quite seamless for sharing. So that's an aspect, I suppose, of what has shifted around home surveillance systems, is the way they're networked into the infrastructure of the home and then across a range of homes, becoming something of a system or a city infrastructure. And Ring marketing is very much targeted to this idea of protecting you from violence outside the home. If you watch the commercials, you'll see it right away. It's intruders, it's people who are going to come and steal stuff, it's people who you don't know wearing dark hoodies in the middle of the night at your front door. So there's a lot of that marketing of like keep people out of your home that you don't want intruding or from stealing your things. And then on the flip side, there's also the aspect of convenience. So, maybe it's not dangerous, but you can talk to somebody who's at your front porch. You could let somebody into your house if you need to. And for whatever reason, the commercials also really focus on the convenience of knowing whose dog it was that pooped on your front lawn. So I don't know. Anyway, we can unpack that, but we won't. So really pitched around this idea of security, and that connects with the idea of networks with police and law enforcement as well. And while Ring hasn't overtly stated that it protects against intimate partner violence, Ring has entered into some high-profile partnerships with a range of different organizations in the United States, where the purpose of the partnership has been to distribute the camera and other aspects of the surveillance system to survivors of intimate partner violence. And so there is also this sort of PR move, and it's been advocated in some of the media that cover these partnerships as allowing survivors to feel safe, quote unquote, inside their homes. So at an individual level, we can think about, there could be obvious benefits to having a surveillance camera outside the home to having a video camera that can alert you to when somebody's at your front porch. People who have a legitimate concern for violence, especially for somebody who might enter into the home or be monitoring their home, you can see on an individual level the aspects of the system that can be beneficial or can be framed as a technical solution. But what we caution in our piece is we have to be cautious of any approach that ignores or fails to see beyond the intended operation of the system. So the system is, pitched as, well, you'll get a notification on your phone whenever someone's at your front porch, you can see who it is, and then, I don't know, and then what, It doesn't really say. I suppose the inference is you can then call the police to have a carceral solution to that risk. But by ignoring edge cases, ignoring abusability, as are centered by feminist cybersecurity authors who we canvass, the system is not structured necessarily in a way that's actually going to provide the kind of security that it's pitched as, and we could almost even say that it creates a home insecurity system through unpacking the different layers of the way that systems Ring is just an example, not exclusively picking on Amazon, but we are picking on Amazon. One example of how we can unpack the layers of risk that are introduced into the home through the technology. So in the paper, we unpack 4 layers of tech-facilitated violence that are enabled through the home surveillance system. The first is very much that sort of traditional cybersecurity focus, where a Ring camera system can actually introduce the possibility of hacking. And I thought for this, I will just tell you directly from, the Federal Trade Commission in the United States, which is a consumer protection body, initiated a complaint against Ring last summer, very conveniently timed with some of what we were thinking about. And so straight from their complaint, what the FTC says is Ring failed to implement standard security measures to protect consumers' information from well-known online threats of third-party hacking, despite warnings from employees, outside security researchers, and media reports. So what this resulted in was hackers were able to exploit account vulnerabilities and access stored videos, live video streams, and account profiles of approximately 55,000 US customers. Bad actors not only viewed their videos, but also used Ring's two-way functionality to harass, threaten, and insult customers, including elderly individuals and children whose rooms were monitored by Ring cameras. For example, hackers taunted several children with racist slurs, sexually propositioned individuals, and threatened families with physical harm if they didn't pay ransom. So the first layer is that traditional cybersecurity focus. We could say that more traditional cybersecurity methods would advocate against this kind of vulnerability. Ring essentially blamed it on people reusing passwords rather than, sort of understanding or envisioning the systemic ways in which we would see this kind of attack. So that led to the FTC investigation, some class action litigation, et cetera. Okay, so, maybe Ring or other types of companies that run surveillance systems beef up cybersecurity issues. What if the technology itself creates the security issue? So from a Federal Trade Commission investigation, we also learned that Ring employees were using Ring cameras to access the inside of customer homes. So I'll just read it to you again because it's damning. The Federal Trade Commission charged Ring with compromising its customers' privacy by allowing any employee or contractor to access consumers' private videos. The allegations include that employees accessed thousands of video recordings from at least 81 female customers, including from private spaces in their homes, like bathrooms and bedrooms. And then in that same complaint, they also say that Ring used the video information collected from customers to train its algorithms without properly obtaining consent in advance. But when we think about things like tech-facilitated gender-based violence, it's very evident that the system itself is enabling gender-based violence in the home. Through its marketing as a security tool, it actually becomes a tool for gender-based misogynistic violence. Ring settled with the FTC for $5.6 million from that investigation, but these are all exclusively focused on US customers because the FTC's jurisdiction is only in the United States. So a failure to consider abusability or the abuse of trust of the system makes it really evident how these forms of violence can become disproportionate or can disproportionately affect certain customers as well, going back to everything Jane laid out in our introduction. Okay, so those are two layers of maybe more like the traditional or human-centric cybersecurity focus, but we also look at critiques of the partnerships Ring entered into with organizations meant to support survivors of intimate partner violence. And there were a range of critiques, including in some cases that survivors weren't adequately consulted before those partnerships were arranged. But even, maybe in contexts where the process was more inclusive, the Ring system necessarily relies on a policing response. So the idea that you have this surveillance footage that can alert you to somebody being outside the home who maybe is a legitimate threat being outside the home, the sort of next logical step is that the police need to be called. But the policing response as the only response can actually engage violence, further violence for the individual, including through their own arrest, which quite unfortunately and somewhat predictably we do see in cases of intimate partner violence where it's the victim who suffers the carceral response, maybe exclusively or in addition to the abuser. And, which we already alluded to, the abuser might themselves obtain control over the system, facilitating pervasive surveillance and control of at least the entryway of the home, if not the whole inside of the home, like through this remote controlled drone, potentially, other inner private spaces of the house, thus enabling further gender-based tech-facilitated violence. Through the use of this particular kind of system to respond, like this tech solutionist approach to gender-based violence, we also see the expectation shifted to the target of potential violence to manage their own security through the system. The system is meant to make this much easier through things like push notifications onto your phone. But again, this is, this ease of managing your own safety through a push notification saying somebody's at your front door is actually shifting a systemic problem onto individuals and onto the individuals who are targeted with the violence. In an actual incident of violence, it would only serve as a passive tool of observation. Hilla Koskela has a wonderful piece about CCTV cameras, well, wonderfully helpful, not wonderful content, about CCTV cameras as only passive tools of observation. So when you experience violence that is filmed, that doesn't actually protect you from the violence itself. And we've seen in other contexts as well that sometimes having video footage, even showing a violent interaction or harm being suffered, doesn't necessarily serve as proof or validation of what the survivor says was their experience. And then finally, we point out that the marketing around this sort of fearfulness and like protect yourself from threats outside the home fans a culture of distrust, which is actually the opposite of what helps to address, I shouldn't say resolve, but helps to address intimate partner violence, which is building community bonds and networks and trust relationships with neighbors, for instance. Ring, sort of on a more structural level, opposes some of what would actually be more useful and beneficial. So that's sort of the third layer that we unpack, is that in particular in contexts of the risk of gender-based violence, the tool can actually become a facilitator of that violence. And then finally, we unpack a more structural, systemic level of the way in which the technology can enable further violence, which is through the appeal to community and law enforcement networks and carceral strategies for dealing with sort of these amorphous threats. So by enabling or encouraging a system of home-based surveillance of public spaces, systems like Ring are actually enabling systemic insecurity through criminalization of public existence or the othering of those captured on film, and then an appeal to interpersonal and state policing as a response. So just to break down what I mean by that. So for instance, the home cameras create quote unquote evidence of, say, individuals who are walking up and down the street, of things that happen on the street, in front of the home, etc. And then encourages reporting with that information, either to sort of a neighborhood app so that your neighbors can know what's also going on, or directly to the police. Again, that's really particularly in the United States in terms of Amazon's involvement, but there are structures for that to happen in Canada as well. Which can lead to things like reporting on suspicious people in the neighborhood, either to your neighbors or to police, saying like, oh, this person's walked up and down the street 5 times, like I find that suspicious. Well, I mean, hopefully the red flags are immediately going off that individuals who are more likely through political and social marginalization to experience profiling, to experience being treated as a threat are more likely to suffer the targeting from that kind of video collection and evidence. Chris Gilliard, who's an academic from the United States, has a beautiful essay on this in relation to Ring. The name of the essay just slipped my mind, but if you Google Chris Gilliard, Amazon Ring, you will undoubtedly find it. Totally recommend it. And he actually makes the point that also a lot of activities that, sure, yeah, maybe technically would violate, say, the criminal code, but people would dismiss as, okay, this isn't really worth dealing with or reporting. The minute they're caught on video and that video is really easy to share, people may have an inclination to be more likely to share that. And so it creates a crime out of something that was otherwise maybe an inconvenience. So he gives the example of like kids throwing eggs and hitting a car. Like, you might find that really annoying, but you might not necessarily turn that into a policing situation. You might say, get out of here, and then clean the car. But as soon as you have footage of it, there is this tendency, and then the whole structure of the system really plays into the tendency to then send that to the police and turn that into a policing situation, which may not otherwise happen. So we have this like streamlining that can occur through the system. And so we argue in the piece that this disproportionately affects people who, due to structures of social and political marginalization, are subject already to hypervisibility, profiling, suspicion, and treatment as dangerous, which creates insecurity through this home surveillance system that's structured in sort of a marketing way as being a security system. The last point we add to that is that Amazon has also long sort of gone back and forth about whether to integrate facial recognition into its home security networks. So its facial recognition system's called Recognition, but spelled with a K. After 2020, Amazon said that it was not going to integrate recognition into Ring, but it has nevertheless continued to develop recognition. And you might be familiar with the term recognition or the system because the CBSA, so Canada's border control services, just that CBSA deportation app that was just revealed through algorithmic impact assessment not long ago. So it's basically an app that's used to monitor people who are subject to deportation orders. They use Amazon Recognition. So, obviously this is just my mind being pessimistic, but it doesn't feel unfathomable to imagine that Amazon could integrate the same facial recognition it uses to, say, monitor people who are perhaps going to be deported, to integrate that into the home surveillance networks that we have of our public spaces, making for a very precarious situation for anybody who might be subject to a deportation order or have their photo retained by CBSA. I'm hypothesizing here, that's not what is happening, but it's the same facial recognition system that we're looking at. So we lay out these sort of 4 layers becoming increasingly structural to basically highlight the point that by not seeing beyond the intended purpose of the technology, security approaches to thinking about things like home surveillance systems would miss or overlook a range of ways in which the system itself creates either a risk of violence or actual violence. And that leads us into our recommendations, which we have on the slide.
Yeah, we just put them on the slide because we didn't want to, we weren't going to belabor it because we wanted to talk to you about it. So I'll just put them up there for you to see. And so we'll obviously invite your questions. If you don't have any for us, we've got one for you to kick things off. Yeah.
Hi. I was kind of curious what, if you see specifically, say, let's say for Amazon Ring, there are vulnerabilities in how it is designed, right? Whether it is in the access, for example, the employee access. That's a sort of management level design issue that can be fixed. Assume that we fix all these design issues that sort of, like the low hanging fruit, right? The access, the password, so on. What kind of risk would you think that it poses then? Would it pose a subset, or do you think there are other new ones?
I'll go in there.
Yeah, you go
Or-
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So like if we imagine that Amazon or any home surveillance type corporate system addresses some of those, like the low hanging fruit, like the obvious security issues, that doesn't get into the third or especially fourth layer of risk of insecurity that can be created through the system, which to my mind calls into question, what are we doing with this surveillance network in the first place? So I think if the focus were, and I'm sure it probably is, if the focus were, let's make sure we don't have these sort of internal security risks anymore. We'll have better employee monitoring policies. We'll have, we'll focus a lot of attention and prioritize sort of external hacking, third-party threats, and make sure that those are not a risk anymore. You're focusing on a very individual level of risk of insecurity. So it might make the individual user less at risk of certain kinds of tech facilitated violence, but that approach still wouldn't touch on things like, what if I share my password with my partner to access my camera because I think it would be helpful if they answered the door one day instead of me, but then, that leads to their having access to the ability to monitor everything I do inside my home. Amazon's not dealing with that level of risk, but even further than that, we're not getting into that bigger systemic consideration of what happens to everyone who is now captured on that footage and my ability to control what happens with that footage and where I share it and how it's used.
And that leads, like, I think beautifully into the something that's a current obsession with mine. So I tend to, wherever I have the opportunity, I tend to foist it on other people. So here we go. So for a while I've been thinking about this question of the as many people have, about the breakdown of individual choice and consent. It's sort of its inability really to, like, even if we fixed all the sort of the internal threats and so on, or external threats with respect to the content, and I make a choice to deploy this kind of technology, and it actually makes me feel more secure. Maybe it even does make me more secure, although for a lot of reasons we might not think there is. But then at the end of the day, my individual choice is not just affecting me, right? That fourth layer of systemic violence, my decision is a decision about monitoring public space, and that affects a broader public. And this is true in many, like, I think we have an urgent crisis on this in many areas, including vaccination, sort of public health concerns. This how do we deal with this respect for individual choice and autonomy, and think about the public consequences, which with technology are sort of amplifying every day, and the ways that individual choices are impacting entire groups and other people are just snowballing. So that I've become really interested in this question of how we can have your thoughts. How can we have a discussion as a community or as communities about what would be a productive way of talking about how thinking about how we exercise our individual choice impacts the broader community? Is that a useful dialogue to have? Could it make a difference? Because, you know, otherwise we're sort of, on the other end of it, we're kind of looking at, I think, having tighter regulation on technology with public consequences. I'm not sure people have an appetite for that. Unlike me, a lot of people don't have an appetite on that sort of thing. So what do you think? Like, are these things that you think about when you choose to deploy whatever it is, to post that picture on Facebook, to, you know, deploy Amazon Ring, to, you know, like, do you think about the consequences for other people? And if not, is that a useful conversation to have? How could we have that? Or if you don't want to answer that, somebody else might have a question.
Sure, there's an answer to this. I'll just talk about, you asked what I think about that.
Yeah.
And I don't remember, but I was in your techno students class last year, and it was interesting just coming back to listen to you. And I think just by sitting in that class, I started to think, when I did my first book, I used to think of consequences for me and what I want to share with the world. But just sitting in your class and thinking about who appears in that picture, and that there's possible consequences for them, even as you, and kind of like the way that technology makes that possible. Yes, now I'm beginning to think about it thanks to you and that class. And yes, I think it is, perhaps it's simplistic really, and I tend to simplify things because my brain's not very complicated. But I think it's a useful conversation to have, yes. But I also think, again, tie back to the idea that you said about consent and individual choices, because I think that, and perhaps again, this is maybe simplistic, but I find that a lot of the research around what's happening with technology kind of takes agency from people and imagines that they have no idea what they're doing. Oh, this technology is going to be, you know, this very thing that's very dangerous, and you have no idea, and so the government should take steps to protect you from it. I think that perhaps should dial back on trying to take back agency from people in the choices that they make. I acknowledge that there's people who's vulnerable, and I think that even in the way that society is structured, there's a lot more around if people are vulnerable, society is structured to protect them from that, and I totally acknowledge that. But if, and I know that that is not always binary, vulnerable or not, but for some people who have a greater range of ability to make choices, I think that perhaps we don't want to deploy limited regulatory resources, for instance, in telling them what choices they should make.
This is, well, I mean, this question came to me when I was listening to CBC this morning, because they were talking about vaccination hesitancy and questioning whether the public discourse had failed because we needed to find ways to recognize that there were individuals with legitimate concerns, and that there had to be a way of talking about the public health concern while also acknowledging and dealing with individual concerns. So this is, I extrapolated that to the issue of technology. But yeah, David.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to intend to listen and not to intervene because I'm interested, but that last point does kind of go against everything we know about marketing and choice. Like, choice doesn't happen. We're not heroic individuals who construct our own selves. Our choices are made. And the fact this is Amazon. Amazon is trying to construct our choices in our environment. That's its whole purpose, right? So it's not that we respond in some kind of individual way with perfect information, able to deal with this in any way at all. They're making our choice for us, and they're making choices for communities. And that's exactly, they're trying to create a closed ecosystem in which our choices are entirely structured by what they give us.
On Cyber Monday.
Exactly, on everything. Not just in this way, but in everything. I mean, Elon Musk has basically just brought the presidency as well. So we're looking at tech corporations who are basically trying to create a closed world with perfect surveillance and control in which they give us choices. So I don't think anymore we can rely on the idea that individual choice is going to solve this problem at all. We need to start breaking things. Seriously, breaking a lot of things. It's no accident Andreas Malm's book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, has been so successful, right? We are at the point where we're in a global crisis and we need to start breaking things.
Do you have ideas about how to
I don't know.
how to
it's
get in
very
the
frustrating.
how to have the dialogue? That's the thing, without sounding like you're telling people, stop being dupes.
Well, it
Right?
depends what you mean by
Feminists got
people.
into a problem with this years ago,
Yeah.
right?
It depends what you mean by people, right? We know that talking to comfortable middle class people, which is generally everybody in this room, we're not going to have that kind of conversation that makes much use to the world anyway, right?
Right.
I think plenty of people who suffer from the consequences already know this. They don't need to be persuaded. But we're not the people who need to be convinced, I guess, anyway.
And I do think in the context of like the ring example, I mean, there is, like on that third layer that we talked about, like there is a structural systemic problem of misogynistic violence that intersects with other aspects of identity and position that is very real. And I don't want to sound like this is judgment of a survivor of that kind of violence or someone who's worried about that kind of violence, thinking like, oh, I'm now to blame for like
Right.
over policing in my community because I need a camera on my front door. I think to your point, like the problem is Amazon and other companies are jumping in on what is a structural problem that we as a society are failing to address, like Doug Ford failing to acknowledge the problem just last week. We're failing to address, and then turning that in, and then using that to amplify another structural problem that we're failing as a community to address. And it's almost like individualizing two structural problems. And then you put people in this awkward position of saying, I need something to protect myself, but I don't want to hurt other people. But what am I supposed to do? I've got nothing left but individual choice, or it feels like I've got nothing left but individual choices. And that's where things like, I think the advertising approach of companies like this as like everyone outside your home is a threat is actually like really getting to part of the problem, which is that it's trying to undermine community bonds to sell friggin' products. And it's really those community bonds that could help to address maybe even both. And I'm not pretending like having good relationships with your neighbor solves everything, but could actually be more the important systemic response, which these companies are intentionally, I think, trying to undermine. If that makes sense.
Other questions or somebody?
I just wanted to respond to your question with, this may be a bit of a hot take. Where are we going to have the discourse?
Yeah.
Right, the third spaces are dying, public spaces are dying, online spaces are like, trying not to swear here, because all the terms related to what's happening are not suited for academic context. But like online spaces are dying and are suffering from mismanagement, to put it lightly. So there's, at the moment, there are very few productive like spaces where we can have these productive discourses that we so sorely need. Maybe that's a very sad view of the world. I hope you can correct me on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, like that, I think that's a really important point. We've got very fragmented sort of bubbles of online discourse that doesn't help us sort of talk across difference, and it also undermines at the same time undermines our ability to look beyond blaming each other and to look up and look around at the systems that Kristen and David are talking about, and start to question why our choices are so limited, and then what we could start thinking about doing to address that. But yeah, I like we ran in the Equality Project, we ran a deliberative dialogue with young people, and we brought in some policymakers, and it was just like literally in a physical space where people could sort of talk to each other. And so that's it's not I don't know how you scale that, but that, you know, at the end of the day, after sort of a few decades actually about thinking about this, is what I'm starting to think about is like sort of small scale community dialogue, and there's lots of impressive examples of things like that going on around the province in particular, that I know about. It's not but that takes funding, and it takes organization, and it takes people who have time to do those sorts of things. Yeah. Other questions or comments? It doesn't have to relate to the way that I shunted this off.
So large tech companies like Amazon, Apple, all of the FANG companies, they really sell themselves on their interoperability, their ability to create networks, like contain networks within a larger system of surveillance and control. What do you make of the, I guess, encroachment of all of these combined technologies on like forming the daily lives of humans?
It's a good question. It's not an immediate answer to the question, but what that makes me think of is really like I'm 100% guilty of it, you know, is like the convenience, like the play into convenience, I guess, that comes from it. Like that comes from that sort of advertisement of like, you can be integrated and that makes things easy. And it truly, like on an individual level, can make things very easy. And I think this goes back to maybe that thinking about, you know, on an individual level, we have to make certain choices in our day-to-day lives, and conveniences are appealing and necessary, and will also be crucial depending on, again, sort of like your position and status in relation to the technologies that you rely on. And so ultimately, I think this gets at David's earlier point, like what we come back to is what are the limits or constraints on those who create and then operate the systems. And that's where, I mean, even this is going a little off topic, but like even when we talk about things like deep fake intimate images, and the way that the response is often like, oh, we're going to criminalize it. It's like, okay, like criminalizing one person who makes intimate images, you know, people will have a range of different opinions on that. I personally don't think it's an effective approach, but, you know, I'm open to, there's a range of opinions on that. Regardless, it doesn't get at the bigger issue, which is why is it so easy to make and then especially distribute intimate images later. And again, it goes back to that idea of like the regulatory structures are often just as individually focused as the advertising structures, and not focused on those who create the infrastructure in the first place for a range of reasons. And the skeptic in me thinks that the next 4 years bodes very poorly for seeing any kind of improvement in that situation, at least in the US context. I don't know, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It kind of goes to that sort of last point about this need for a broader holistic strategy, because one of the problems, and we've already seen just in the way I posed that first question, one of the problems is it can get really easy to see low-hanging fruit and then present addressing that as having dealt with it. And often the low-hanging fruit is the individual. It's, you know, so we tell the individual, you know, here's the impact of your choice. You know, even if we could describe to you what the technology is doing in terms of surveillance, you know, we sort of, we leave it up to you. You know, so that sort of downloading and individualization, which is actually perfect from the perspective of corporate power, right? Because while we're all amongst ourselves, I say this all the time to my cyber feminism students, while we're all pointing fingers at each other, monetizing all of it, right? And so it's easy not to have systemic discussions, in part because sometimes it's actually hard to talk about. And so I think that's another thing that Val Steves, who's my co-leader on the Equality Project, has really invested a lot of her time and energy, and the energy of the project in trying to think about ways about talking about some of these concepts that you're adverting to in a way that are accessible and meaningful to people, so it doesn't just, ring like some kind of conspiracy theory, but that it's actually a rational, logical explanation of how things work in order for a relatively small group of people to make a lot of money. It's perfectly rational. It's not a conspiracy in a capitalist economy. I don't know if that answers, but yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to read this paper. This is fantastic. I really appreciate the way you've articulated specific calls for action. I find I get that part really trips me up anytime I'm working on this. I lean towards more blow it up, break stuff, rather than actionable items.
That can be a call to action.
Yeah,
Just for the record.
Can you speak to the third call for action a bit more? Resist unthinking resort to techno-solutionist responses to complex problems. Just to explain a bit more what you mean.
Yeah. Well, I think it goes to this. It goes back to. I'm going to forget the name of the academic who talks. Sorry. I know everything goes back to Langdon, but yeah, you've heard me talk too many times. He talks about techno-solutionism.
Morozov.
Yes, that's right, Morozov, about techno-solutionism and the idea that it can be really easy, especially if you think the problem is posed as a problem of technology, to respond with more technology, right? And for convenience sake, for for scalability, for like all of these reasons, it can be very easy to sort of resort to that. And this is calling just for that step back, that sort of says, there have been complex human problems for a really long time, and the sort of idea that we could, program them out of existence, I mean, we should probably think about as being naive, and I think we don't necessarily do that as much. And it's hard to do because when you do that, you're often a Luddite, right? You're against progress. That goes back to LinkedIn. You're against progress, right? And so to think about ways of doing that leaves space for saying we have to think about what our definitions of progress are, and we have to. Which is not to say there aren't technological solutions to problems. Of course there are, but to be a little bit more careful about not assuming that the go-to automatically should be technology.
And there's a real policy appeal to that too. Like, if you're the mayor of a city and you can set aside $1,000 to buy a bunch of Amazon Ring doorbell cameras and distribute them to people and be like, I have solved intimate partner violence, like do a photo op. I'm being a little facetious, but like there's a policy appeal to this like ease that comes with techno solutions to complex human problems, where to actually get at the root cause of that complex human problem would mean norm change and culture shift and, probably some combination of cross-jurisdictional funding and, changing what we feel shame and comfort with. It is a multifaceted approach to actually address the issue. But I can pay some company to look really good and put a Band-Aid solution on it. And again, it's like, I'm sure there are a lot of people who come from a very good place who are doing that because they're like, what's within my power? It's this thing. And that goes back to that bigger question of like, why are our choices so constrained? That the choice for doing this is I only have X amount of budget, so I'm just going to do what I can and take the techno Band-Aid solution that's so like so like with the glossy advertisement pitched to me by some tech company that sees the potential here for profit, I'm going to take that because the alternative is too complex for the position that I'm in and the power that I have. Which, I mean, I think we can question that, but I can imagine that it genuinely feels that way sometimes.
Well, and then the sort of, when you think about the election cycles as well, right?
Yeah.
Like the long-term systemic change is like really doesn't get you anywhere when you're in an election campaign, right? So
Yeah.
so when you can point to, you know, we implemented facial recognition technology, it increased arrests this much, you know,
Yeah.
it decreased crime this much. Whereas you're not going to be able to have a conversation about the long-term change that's needed.
Yeah.
In a 4-year election cycle, you're just like not.
I mean, I'll shit talk a little. The mayor of the city where I live right now is like, we'll just implement facial recognition, Project Greenlight. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It was initiated in Detroit. It's a facial recognition system. It's called Project Greenlight because there's literally a bright green light attached to the camera to tell you, because like then you're consenting to it, to tell you this camera uses facial recognition. So Windsor has adopted it as, we consider ourselves a suburb of Detroit. So what Detroit does, we're like, oh, we'll do that 4 years later. Instead of addressing, you know, complex policy challenges, like how do we deal with the growing issue of poverty in a city that has one of the lower average household incomes across the country? How do we resolve that issue? No, instead we're going to put $10,000 into a bunch of facial recognition cameras that we're going to put downtown with a big green light so no one can complain that they didn't consent to this. And that's the solution. And it's like sort of the case in point. I think that personally comes from like a less heartfelt and more law and order mindset, but you know, sometimes it can be more heartfelt, I think, but it's the same tech solutionism that we see cross-cutting like a lot of these different areas, including, you know, intimate partner violence, like we've been talking about.
Questions or comments? Yeah.
Just said, I think one of the problems that we're facing is the solutions are based on an election cycle. And to get to those deeper conversations and the longer solutions that will take time to make change of socioeconomic status, we need everyone, not just the politicians, but the voters, to be more patient and wait through and not kind of force the hand of politicians to do something immediately so they get voted back in. So I think that's just one element that plays a factor in us being able to get past that, get into a bigger position.
Yeah, trying to, how do you reward long-term? How do you reward long-term thinking?
I mean, I'm going on a tangent now, so please bear with me. I could be totally wrong. If anyone in the room is like, what are you talking about? I don't actually know what I'm talking about. But it makes me think about things like smoking, right? Like there was a major multi-decade shift in this country and other places to discourage smoking on various levels of government. Like, what is it? Maybe someone in the room knows the answer, or I'm just totally talking bullshit. But what was it about smoking that everyone could get on board and say, "Oh, Marina knows the answer," and make that shift?
It's the class actions that started costing a lot of money that switched the thinking, and I think the private right of action in these cases may lead to some may push some of the change. I'm not really sure that it's going to make that, but I think it's when it becomes expensive, then the mind shift changes, and we're looking, and then the governments get involved because all of a sudden it gets expensive in ways that the governments are benefiting, right? And so then we're looking at the tax incentives and other things that benefit the governments and they benefit. So I think private right of action is the way to go to sort of start this stage.
And that goes, I know I saw you come in just before you got here. We were talking about like going for the systemic versus the individual solution. And class actions are, I mean, they're like a collected group of individual actions. So still an individual approach, but the consequences are felt by those that create the system. And so that goes exactly to that idea of like, how do you turn attention away from individuals having to make different choices into forcing, whomever it is, whether it's Amazon or what are smoking companies, Phillips and Hedges, like whether it's whomever it is that's setting up the structure, turning the attention there.
Well, and the other great thing, I'm speaking as an old civil procedure professor, the other really interesting thing with class actions is also the remedies can be more systemic as well, right? Like they're not, we're not limited in the way that we are in individual rights of action. So that I've often thought that those were interesting. It's just that they're so slow and they're so expensive, and sometimes, especially if you're talking collective language, you're going just to a court. They're not necessarily the best at collective language or human rights kind of language. But yeah, Jason.
I mean, the smoking example is a great one. The thing I worry about with technology is that with cigarettes, the whole product is a mess. It's like it's not just a part of, like, it's not like you're arguing for one aspect of the product.
The filter is
It's
good, but
these techniques, right? The filters, like not advertising to kids. I mean, we're not even close to that with technology, with like social media or something like that. But so I worry that what we're going to see is responses like we're seeing right now with all the, I don't know if you noticed the advertising in the last month or so that Instagram has come out with. Like the only commercials I ever see online now are, we're putting protections in place for to keep kids safe and blah blah blah, because they're threatening some sort of action. But what I worry about is that, I mean, with something like a social media platform, where that's where the harms are being spread, it's like it's one aspect of the design that you might focus on. Like there's just so much more that's wrong. Like there's just so many ways to shift the focus, and we fixed that problem. Now we're doing all these other things. It's not like a cigarette where like the whole thing's just got to go. I
we
mean,
learned along the way to design things in a way that it's not just, you know what I mean? I think part of it is like industries adapt.
yeah.
Yeah, but cigarettes are a discrete consumer product. This is the whole system of communication.
ecosystem.
that we live in. It's a different
It's an
thing.
ecosystem.
Yeah.
Whole different
Yeah. But not that I'm against this approach. I mean, I think regulation is like absolutely essential. There's not enough of it. I don't know why there isn't more of it now. I do and I don't. You get it. But the other thing I wanted to just sort of think out loud about is like this, like you talked a lot about kind of like tech literacy, right? Like this is all part of tech literacy. And I think back to, now about 30 years ago, when the World Wide Web kind of emerged and computers were in every home all of a sudden. And back then there was a lot of talk of, now like kids of the future are going to be so tech literate that they're just going to be able to make amazing choices and build like a better world with all this stuff. And what I see now is that they're like nobody's more literate. Like they use, like I think what we mistook for literacy was being on being on the tech. Like it's like how somehow like if you're playing video games, you're like video game literate or something like that. Or like if you're on social media, you're social media literate. Like it's just not what's happening. So when I look at my kids are in university now, like, when I look at what they were teaching them throughout this this time where they were on, Snapchat and these things, like in the schools, none of it was about tech literacy. It was like the stuff that I was doing when I was a kid, like teaching them about what advertising on TV will do to them. It's like when the first time my kids saw a TV commercial, they thought it was a short film. Like they were like, what is that short thing? What was that show we just watched? That was a funny show. That was what came out of their mouths. Like they didn't even know it was an ad, you know what I mean? So when I look at this, and think of like, how do you break the system? Like I'm just so frustrated by all of it, and I feel so deflated that I feel like we need to just somehow be focusing on
kids and starting there, like we're done, we failed, right? Like maybe the kids.
Bring back the house hippo.
Give up on the adults.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean we need to be a part of the solution, obviously, but I don't want to. But
So,
it's
yeah.
discouraging. Right?
Yeah,
So but
it
this,
is.
like but the literacy can't start with us. I don't think. Like we've been doing this for years.
Well, and there's interesting questions about what the literacy entails, right? And again, this is a dial that we've tried to shift in e-girls, and we've tried to
Yeah,
start
you've
a
done
shift
amazing work.
in equality. To think about whether digital literacy, to the extent that digital literacy campaigns are basically teaching kids how to protect themselves from a system that they have to accept, and from starting to understand the system that they're surrounded by, and talk to them about the ways that they can their rights in relation to that, and the spaces where they can go for support to push forward those rights. And I do think that we are starting to see a shift and away from that digital native language, which I think is the one that you're talking about, which is, yeah, I mean, you can, you know, one of my kids is in the back of the room. You know, I don't know how to do anything on my phone, and they can do that in 3 seconds, but it doesn't mean that you understand and feel like you have power over the systems that are operating on you in that environment, right? And we really need to be, again, exploding.
I'm so glad you said that. That's exactly, like, as you were saying that, I'm like, I think it's a political education also that
Yes.
Yeah.
that, like, I guess we all would benefit from, but kids especially, in knowing what you said, Jane. I just want to like emphasize it, that they don't have to accept the system as it's given to them. Like that, I think, maybe more than anything, like when I think about deepfakes as an example, it's like yes, there's the digital education of like, how do I get this taken down off the internet? But there's a much equally or much more important education of, I don't have to accept, like, this is a violation of my rights. And I think maybe some of the greater progress can be made in that political space of knowing you're entitled to more than the limited number of choices that you're being
sure.
given. And then knowing how to fight for that.
And then adults have to back it up.
Yeah.
That's the problem. Like, we created a system that absolutely sucks. And then we go to kids. It's like the environment. We're
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
kids are gonna save the environment. Like, okay, but like, what are the adults doing? What are the people doing who created the situation in the first place? And how are we creating an atmosphere in which they can be supported? And where we're not putting the responsibility on them to figure it out. That's it's that balance that's can be a little tricky. Okay.